From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
I'm Nima Kulkarni, and this is Where Y'all Really From. And today we're talking about something you hear us say at the top of every episode, our names. Your name is usually the first thing you share when you meet new people. And if you're an immigrant, your name can either make you blend in or mark you as a perpetual other. So we sat down to talk about it. In this conversation, you'll hear from Dan Wu, Charlene Buckles, and me. Enjoy!
Tell me, Nima and Dan, a story of your name or about your name. Nima, you want to go first?
Sure. So my full name is actually Nirupama, but I've been called Nima since the day I was born, I think, or since I was named. And it's interesting because I'm only Nirupama on official documents, and it's really because my grandfather thought that Nirupama was too long a name for such a little baby. And, you know, it's not for any reason. It's easier to say, but it's basically something that they had to do because in Hindu culture, the sound that the name begins with, like ni, like there's a lot of thought that goes into it. So it had to start with ni. It just had to be Nirupama. So even the nickname had to start with ni. My brother's name is Nikhil. So it's just, there's a whole lot involved. But essentially, my name, Nirupama, means beyond compare or incomparable. And so there's a whole lot of thought put into the meaning behind names, the number of letters in the name, the sound that the name begins with. And so oftentimes, you know, babies aren't named until several days until after they're born. But I just thought it was, you know, I've been told my whole life that, you know, it's Nirupama, but I had to really grow into that name. But everyone's called me Nima since. Dan,
what about you? Do you have a story about your name?
Yeah, the story is kind of about basically why I'm Dan Wu. In Chinese, your surname comes first, and most Chinese names have 3 characters or 3 syllables. So my name in Chinese is actually Wu Dan Hong. In China, people would refer to me as Dan Hong, like my whole sort of given name. So when I came here, where my first name sort of falls in American culture just happened to be Dan. So I didn't have to change my name and just kind of waltzed right into an Americanized name. And the only time that I give anybody else a hard time is if they try to call me Daniel and I have to correct them and say my name is not Daniel. It's actually just Dan. So it's very interesting. I will sometimes have Chinese people who don't know me really well. They will talk to me in Chinese and call me Wu Dan, which is not my complete name. So that's how I know they don't actually really know me, that they just know me from my American name, and then they flip it into Chinese. So it's all kind of very interesting. But my parents both at some point in their adult lives here in America Americanized both their first names. And I imagine that's a very common story for us.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get into that a little bit too later. I wanted to share too, because I feel like both of you all have very intentional names, and your parents put a lot of thought in your all's names. I don't think there was much thought in my name. My name's Charlene Ann Rubio was my maiden name. And the Philippines was, you know, they were colonized for 300, 200 years by the Spanish and then by the Chinese and Americans. And so there were a lot of Western influences in the Philippines. But my mom was just like, I really just like that name, which I'm pretty sure is like French or something. I don't really even know the origins of my name. But what's interesting about like a story that I like to tell about my name when I get asked this icebreaker question is that I did not realize my full name was Charlene Ann until I was like 26, 27 years old. Like we got a copy of my birth certificate on like a very thin, you know, copy paper. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. This is my original birth certificate. And on there was Charlene Ann as my first name. And then my middle name is San Juan, which is my mom's maiden name, and then my last name, Rubio. So when I asked my mom, I was like, I didn't realize my full first name was Charlene Ann, and she was like, I mean, it's fine. Like, I was like, well, it kind of is. So it was just like one of the, because, in Spanish culture, usually your middle name is your mom's maiden name. And so it was she never really thought about it. And then actually when Dan and Nima had asked me about this theme of names in like Asian cultures, and even like when we started this podcast, I think I told you, Dan, that I was going back and forth of whether or not I should go back to Rubio, which is my maiden name, or take on Buckles, which is my married name. And it's kind of a personal story, but I feel like both names are like colonized names. They're colonizers, the origins of that. And so I felt like when I got married, there was a choice, and I was able to now choose which route I wanted to go. And I think that Charlene Ann Buckles, although sounds like an 80-year-old grandmother from, Western Kentucky, it really tied in all the parts of who I am as a Filipina Kentuckian. And so that was the name that I kind of decided and chose. But I do find it so very interesting as Chinese American, Filipino American, South Indian American, and how all of these different trends in our region, in the AAPI region, of like what influences names. And so, Nima, I wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the trends, in Indian culture, South Indian culture, that you see?
Yeah, so there's always been this sort of tradition of nicknames, and it'll a lot of times be just a shortening of the name. So my brother's name, for instance, is Nikhil. He goes by Nick. You've got Ro Khanna in California. I don't know his full name, but I'm sure it's short for something. So you'll find people in Indian culture shortening their name, not necessarily changing it to a more Western name. I mean, if Nick, if it happens, it happens. But the trends, I think, have been certainly in recent years towards, not changing it to Western names. So you've got also people like Bobby Jindal, who that Bobby is obviously a Westernized name. But it's, I think, in recognition of the importance and the intentionality with which really your parents gave you the name. So in your story, I mean, in a lot of ways, yours is the most intentional name because you've chosen it after a lot of thought for your first, maiden last names. What are each of your names to you? For Dan and I, it's probably more what our families, what their intent was, what they wanted to imbue, what kind of meaning, and honestly, what their hopes and aspirations are for this little baby. Because they're very grandiose. In Indian culture, you're named after deities. You might be named after the community or the region you're from, but it's all very, very driven by, identity and culture. And so it's the intentionality, I think, just is with you your whole life. And, maybe it's a lot to live up to. Maybe it informs a lot of decisions you make. It's always there that somebody put a lot of thought into this. I think, there was in the first kind of diaspora, you've got this push to change your name or shorten it or make it more like Western so you fit in better, especially in school, especially if you're a kid. But now I think people, certainly parents, are, making sure that they don't do that. There's a lot of intentionality put back into being in another country and making sure that the name and the importance of the name is retained.
Yeah, and you kind of hinted a little bit at that too, Dan, right, when you were telling your story of, particularly in our parents' generation, when they came here and immigrated here, and we see that as a trend, honestly, for especially the older generation or first-generation immigrants of our parents. Dan, what do you think about that?
I mean, when it comes to names, so much of the immigrant and refugee story, I think, is about our very fraught relationship with integration and assimilation. And a big part of that has to do with the name. It's not just a matter of convenience for people who don't speak our language or don't come from our cultures, is definitely that. But a big part of it is your name is a big part of your identity, right? So for my dad, as Fang Cheng Wu, that's a different identity than Frank Wu. It's a different impression that the outsider would have of his level of foreignness or Americanness, that the Frank is a disarming sort of, you're a little bit more one of us. Whether or not people actually think that, it's an impression from the person who changes the name, right? It's like, I want to be more go with the flow. I don't want to fight against the current so much. I want to be perceived as more American. So I kind of, you can call it lucked out. I kind of lucked out in kind of just falling into that, not having that to have made the choice either by my parents or me. And I've always, had this American name, Dan. And I do wonder about how I'm perceived if my name had been Fang Cheng Wu, you know what I mean, and grown up like that, whether or not at some point, whether or not my parents chose it, if I would have changed my name for the convenience of others to be able to fit in more. I think it's a very, very interesting and complicated issue.
Yeah, and I think for people like our parents who came here when they're 30 and 40 years old, and just trying to assimilate and fit in and not rock the boat, like I do think it was something that they did out of survival, and just so that it just made things easier. Like, how much, not only are you trying to juggle like the culture and the language of coming into a place like Kentucky that's completely different from how you grew up for your first 40 years of your life, but then also like trying to educate how, for how people pronounce your name can be really exhausting. But I do think that sometimes it can be, I don't know if it's a symptom or if it's an effect of that. If you all think, does it play into the role of that model minority? Like, what does that mean for us, like as AAPI, as compared to other minority groups, when we're just trying to fit in?
Yeah, that's absolutely a part of it. I think it goes back to that not rocking the boat, of not making other people nervous or scared or intimidated or afraid of us or feel threatened by us. To me, it feels all part and parcel. And you have to wonder about, not to psychoanalyze ourselves here, but you have to imagine there's some level of sort of tamping down or making negative our own culture by denying those original names, by trying to fit in, by discarding or replacing a more ethnic or a more, name that's closer to our origins, and adopting that American name. And again, like Nima was talking about how Indian names are often shortened, even just in Indian culture, not necessarily just in America. People in China, I think probably since at least the 80s and 90s, when the Hong Kong movie industry was really blowing up, a lot of big-time Hong Kong actors and actresses would adopt sort of a hybrid name or Americanize their name. So like Jackie Chan, for example, like that was his screen name, even though at the time his entire career was in Hong Kong, making, movies in Cantonese. But and this goes for pop stars and other sort of celebrities and stuff. So the Americanized name was a way of saying, hey, we're just as good as American celebrities. We're on the same playing field because we have these same sort of names. So it's basically saying, here are the rules of the game, and I'm going to adapt myself to the rule of the game. And these rules are written by Westerners.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially that last point. When we first moved to Louisville, and I've probably mentioned this on our show before, but my parents couldn't get jobs, right? They're both educated, they have degrees. So they got this small corner grocery store in Germantown. And I always say that because it's a lot of older white people that live there around us. And they couldn't pronounce my parents' names. So, also both of their names start with Su, Sureka and Suhas. So there's a lot of, they have an arranged marriage. And so there's a lot of like intentionality about even just names in terms of who you're going to marry. Like, does it all fit? And so it's interesting because the customers just started calling them Sam and Sue. Like, they are the ones that decided that this is what we're going to call you. And it didn't mean anything, I don't think, negative by it, but they wanted to address them by something and just could not pronounce these names that they'd never heard before. And my parents just kind of rolled with it. I don't think they took offense. I don't think they certainly didn't use those names or adopt them anywhere outside of that, outside of that store. But it was just fascinating to see, everybody sort of just rolling with it and being okay with, now this is your name now. Like, this is what we're going to call you. And that's how everybody, sort of functioned in that world. But I think it's fascinating, how it's important for folks to feel like you're just like one of them. Like, if we call you this, we're more comfortable with having you in our community. And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, actually, because it really centers that American view and still continues to other, which I'm sure, our parents really did not have that autonomy. They didn't feel comfortable to have that autonomy. There was so much risk involved of, are they going to accept me in this community that's predominantly white? And so you just kind of accept it. But I feel now that we, as 1.5 generation, immigrants and the children of these immigrants, I feel like there's a movement in taking that all back, that we have that privilege.
It's time for a break. And when we come back, we'll hear more of our conversation about names, including what we're hearing from the younger folks we know. This is Where Y'all Really From?
Your mornings are busy, and finding the time to stay up to date on what's happening in Louisville and southern Indiana isn't easy. I'm Bill Burton. Join me to stay informed on your terms each weekday with the LPM Daily News Briefing, the news you need to start your day, from Louisville Public Media. See you in the morning.
Welcome back to Where Y'all Really From? I'm Nima Kulkarni. On this episode, we're talking about names. Some immigrants lose their original names, some keep them, and either way has its own set of repercussions.
What Nima's point made me think of the fact that her parents didn't even say, hey, call us Sam and Sue, right. That other people just started doing it. And what it made me think of is, every one of these situations is part of a larger system, right? And you think about Ellis Island and Angel Island where people came through, and this is even back, beyond race. This is back to where Eastern European or Irish or Italian immigrants were coming over, and they were just like, the customs officers were basically like, I can't pronounce this, your name's Jones now. And that's just what it is. I have a friend whose family originally was Lebanese, and his original family name was Yazbek, and they didn't want to deal with it, and they just literally gave them a random name. So now they're Musi, and that's not even a name from any tradition or origin whatsoever. That's just some bureaucrat a couple hundred years ago decided that here's your last name. So it's one of those things for me that if anybody ever says like, oh, this stuff is not a big deal, like shrug it off, the roots of this stuff are so sort of incredible and, to me, emotional and, in some ways violent in a cultural sense, that people are just willing to take this away from us. It's one thing for us to choose to do it for convenience or assimilation or safety. It's another thing for other people just to say, like, nope, you don't get to be who you are. And of course, like, we can, take this all the way back to the enslavement of Africans, the basis of so much of what our country is based on. These folks were brought in here and completely given random names or the names of their enslavers too. So the history is very deep and dark.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting when you talk about bureaucracy like that, because we don't know, right, how many names were just completely erased. And the names obviously carry, connotations of where people came from, what their families did a lot of times, like occupations, what their religion was, what their cultural sort of touchstones were. And all of that is just gone. And for example, like in immigration, law. Like if you're naturalized, like I'm a naturalized citizen on the naturalization certificate, there are a lot of names that are very long. And so there's only so much space still. So this hasn't changed, right? Ever. Only so much space on this document, this, 8.5 by 11 landscape piece of paper. And so you'll find, especially like in South India, there are people with 3 or 4 names that are each like 15 letters long. And so they will just cut off, the last 2, which might be like their grandparents' name or like where they came from, or again, this very intentional, aspirational name that the parent has given their child, and it is just gone from this very official document that they need to survive in this other country. And so I think that is definitely something that exists and has not changed since that time.
It's in a sort of a weird reversal of that, but also like part and parcel of it, being, I guess, having a bureaucracy or having somebody else tell you what your name is. I was filling out a form one time online, and I was trying to put in my last name, and I typed in WU, and it said last name must be 3 letters or longer. And I was like, are you serious right now? I am being microaggressed by a document, by an application that my name is not allowed to be 2 letters. Are you kidding me? So yeah, that was kind of incredible.
That is really interesting to think about that as the immigration system. Of course, the immigration system is doing what it's meant to do, which is to keep people out and to erase histories, right? Like, and then to assimilate, because that's what it's saying. But I find that so interesting because it's not a guard now at Ellis Island. It's in the ways in which it's the paperwork, it's the websites, it's the way that you have to register things, it's the amount of tiny boxes there are that you have to fit within. I mean, this box, like that's what that is. And so I do wonder if, in the soft and in the hard sense of, like, can we reclaim our names? Is there a way now? Do you see trends now that are saying, like, I am going to own this. I'm not going to shorten my name. I'm not going to go by this nickname. I'm going to, really reclaim that self. Or can we, at this point, when you have these like bureaucratic ways in which, we're erasing family histories?
I think you can. I mean, in the same way, Charlene, that you talked about consciously choosing Buckles over Rubio, I think as long as you have agency in making that choice and not being limited as to what the choices are even, then you can reclaim it. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that your name looks like your grandparents' name. You know what I mean? Like, it can be Americanized if that is your choice. And I think that's the difference. It's as long as you're making the choice and not somebody else.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think that is very true of certainly the younger generation. So we're, second generation and on, are very mindful of keeping in very close contact with their culture, right? So in Louisville, we've got a Hindu school, so they'll learn Hindi. They will learn their native language. There's a very active South Indian community where they are very focused on, in the South Indian culture, which I'm not from South India, unfortunately, so none of this was passed down to me, but there's a very strong focus on you have to learn an artistic skill, singing or dancing, poetry, something, and in their language. And so there is a very, very strong need for that particular region to retain that culture. And so I think that is very, very much alive and well in Louisville, Kentucky, right? So in Kentucky, you will have these pockets of very deeply ingrained culture and language and a very clear understanding of what names mean and what truncating them or changing them would do to that heritage and that identity. So I think there was maybe a time when we first started moving here where people were kind of like, there is so much that we have to do to fit in here. And we've got to take care of our families, and there's just so much to navigate. I'm going to let the name thing go. I'm going to shorten it. I'm going to make everyone's life easier, and then we can move on. And now we're fine. We've got, our children. We've got our grandchildren. Everyone's safe. Everyone's stable. And so they can now sort of reclaim that identity, if any of it was lost, just sort of in the shuffle of immigrating to a whole new country.
I also think what's really interesting, this trend that I'm finding with some of the younger generation, is that they are like you all have said, they are purposefully like reclaiming it. But then also there's this, I want to say like it's an attitude almost of like, just don't butcher my name. Just call me Sue. You know what I mean? And like, for example, when my partner was TAing down at Emory, he had a lot of students that were of Korean descent, or like either like first generation, or are from Korea, and they came to the States to go to school. And he would see the name, and of course that first day where they're trying to read the name, and they would just say, don't even try. You're not Korean. You are white. You are for sure white, and do not even try. So just call me Rachel. Like there's no, and like they didn't care. Like they were just like, this has not like, I don't want you to butcher my culture and my name. So just don't even try and don't even go there. And I've had other people, as a Filipino, we do not have a tonal language. I am like totally tone deaf. I have I cannot hear different. And I've tried, like when I was in Thailand and trying to learn the 5 tones. And so it's very difficult for me to like break down words and trying to break down different sounds. And so when I try, many of my API friends who have traditional names are like, it's just really wrong. And like, I mean, I do that even with like English words just generally, but they are just like this. You're just stop, just call me Sue, or just call me this. And I do think that a part of that is that autonomy and being able to have, like, you're not feeling pressured to go by a different name. It's really like, this is who I am. It's not really based on anything, but like, if it's easier for you or for me, where like I'm not hearing scratches on a chalkboard every time you try to pronounce my name, let's do it that way. But I do think that, like, for me, I do feel a sense of obligation to try to learn that culture and to try to see them, because your name is a huge part of who you are. And I think that effort is getting made by allies more or less, but I hope it's getting made, but I don't know. I feel like it's more anecdotal for me than it is like a trend.
I mean, I think that it is definitely a question of having more agency. So it's a preference. It's your individual preference rather than it being a necessity or something that you feel like you have to do, you're obligated to do. So it is up to you to have, that this is fine. Like, I'm fine with you just calling me Sue and not butchering the rest of my name. And I think it's important because that is something we're seeing in a lot of different cultures and a lot of different communities in America. We're at a point, some kind of a tipping point. I mean, there's a demographic shift, and we're at a point now where we feel comfortable saying to our non-AAPI counterparts, look, here's what I would like you to call me. So I'm just gonna make that decision for you. You don't have to worry about it. I don't have to worry about it. Here's what it is. As opposed to how it's been really, I don't think, in my understanding of history or even in recent years, right, that it has been this prevalent. So there's a generational shift in taking that autonomy back, which I think is very, very important. And it's very empowering, in a lot of ways, because that means that they are also recognizing the importance of names for their parents. They remember their grandparents' names. They remember and are researching and are taking in all of their own family history, and then, are able to sort of incorporate that in their day-to-day lives. So it's not becoming this obstacle. It's not even a thing. It's just, this is who I am. I'm completely comfortable. I'm completely aware of everything that went into my name, and this is how I'm choosing to interact with you. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening. I'm Nima Kulkarni, and we'll see you next time on Where Y'all Really From. Where Y'all Really From is created and produced by Dan Wu, Charlene Buckles, May Suramek, and me, Nima Kulkarni. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. Our associate producer is Alex Biscardi. Kojin Tashiro wrote our theme song, and Leanne Gann created our logo. Where Y'all Really From is part of the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator, with support from the Eye Care Institute's Butchertown Clinical Trials. Our Lexington interviews are recorded at Radio Lex with engineering and assistance by Mark Royce. For more information and to keep in touch, visit whereyallreallyfrom.org.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
Coming up on In Conversation, the resurgence of tourism. Join us Friday morning at 11 on 89.3 WFPL at lpm.org or wherever you get your podcasts.